faith communities and civil society during and after conflict. This series is supported by the Institute for Liberal Arts, so first I want to thank them for making it possible. I also want to take a few minutes, if I may, to explain the rationale for this series. I think that those of you who are familiar with liberation theology, for instance, Latin America especially, would not find it unusual to have a topic such as faith communities and civil society. But that situation does not really hold in other parts of the world. And this series focuses on Eastern Europe and the Middle East. My specialty is Eastern Europe, particularly Russia and former Yugoslavia. And that area has undergone tremendous change since the fall of communism, following the Soviet Union in 1991, civil war in former Yugoslavia in 1990 to 1995. And after the loss throughout Eastern Europe, whether we're talking about countries like the former Warsaw Pact nations, or we're talking about the non-aligned communist country of Yugoslavia, there was a search for identity. There was a loss of that overarching ideological identity of communism. Many in this region looked backward to a pre-Soviet, to the pre-communist period, and found or chose religion as the most salient feature of their identity. That religion that they looked back to was more often than not authoritarian, conservative, patriarchal, and we would not expect that that connection of individual identity, particularly with a search for nationhood or the defining of geographical boundaries with power, would be a combination that would work toward creating the organs of civil society or nurturing civil society. That certainly was the case. We speak of ethno-nationalism. We know about the rise of Russian nationalism and anti-Semitism in Russia. In former Yugoslavia, the most tragic post-communist scenario, in that very multi-ethnic state, particularly in the most multi-ethnic republic in the middle, Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was a tragic war. A search for identity, which was allied with a search for land and a search for many for power, involved the only feature of identity that could disentangle these people, and that was either religious faith or more likely religious heritage. So that this notion that one's identity is most connected to one's religious belief or religious heritage is often foisted onto citizens in that region. And this became a virulent kind of nationalism, ethno-nationalism. Obviously, not a space for civil society building. For those of us who work in Eastern Europe, religious leaders, the top of the hierarchy, for us, is the problem. It is the problem. It is not the solution. So the notion that you can find those who find their beliefs or observance their most salient feature of identity or up there in that hierarchy, that there are those people who might come as a surprise, and actually after a period of time in researching this, multiculturalism in civil society was actually a surprise to me to meet those people. That's Eastern Europe. The situation is similar, but for different reasons, obviously, in the Middle East, where for at least 15 years, there has been political chaos, repressive and ever more repressive regimes, and opposition, and war, civil war. And we find there, obviously, religious strife, perhaps more often than not, intra-religious rather than interreligious. But we are very familiar with the concept of political Islam. In former Yugoslavia, they speak of that, and also political orthodoxy and political Catholicism. These are also terms that are used in that territory. And we find that this association of identity or prospective nation building or a search for power is associated, again, with the most authoritative, conservative, repressive, patriarchal form of religious practice. And as we know, those religious leaders are often self-identified. They are not bona fide So these are the regions that this series focuses on, the Middle East and Eastern Europe, those former communist and usually Islamic language-speaking territories. So now I would like to, I do have the honor of introducing our speaker. I should say the second two lectures in the series are on Eastern Europe. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones if you haven't got to do that. I would like to introduce our speaker before I announce the topic of his presentation today. Marc Gopin is the director of the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution, CRDC, and the James H. Lau Professor at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. He has pioneered projects at CRDC in Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Palestine, and Israel. Dr. Gopin has trained thousands of people worldwide in peace-building strategies for complex conflicts. He conducts research on values dilemmas as they apply to international problems of clash of cultures, globalization and development, and social justice. He has authored 5 books on conflict analysis and peace building. His 2012 Bridges Across an Impossible Divide, The Inner Lives of Arab and Jewish Peacemakers, explores the role of self-examination in the resolution of human conflict as portrayed in the lives and testimonies of indigenous peacemakers. He is also the author of To Make the Earth Whole, The Art of Citizen Diplomacy in an Age of Religious Militancy, 2009, and Holy War, Holy Peace, How Religion Can Bring Peace to the Middle East, 2002. And beyond his research and teaching at CRDC, Dr. Gopin has engaged in back-channel diplomacy with religious, political, and military leaders on both sides of conflicts. We are very pleased to have Dr. Gopin with us today, and I think on his part, he may feel like he is at home or near home with family in Brookline and having received his PhD in ethics at Brandeis University. So please let us welcome him.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. It's nice to see so many young folks in the audience. One of the things that's been interesting, I've been working at this for 30 years. Right now I'm a professor, and I have a permanent position at the Center for Religion, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, and it's part of a school on conflict analysis and resolution, which is a 30-year-old field. And that field of conflict analysis and resolution is a combination of international relations, political science, anthropology, and psychology that worked on conflict that was both, that had structures and patterns to it that were as true in the international arena as they were inside the human being, inside the family, inside interpersonal relations, which was quite a struggle with normal academia, which had its strict places of international relations theory and political science theory, anthropology and psychology, and our field innovated the idea and the notion that in order to really understand dynamics of international conflict and global conflict that did not make sense, that were so irrational, that we needed to go beyond the strict notions of state-to-state relations or negotiations theory and look at deeper things that happen in all conflict, in all human conflict, right up to the conflict between you and me, right up to the conflict that's intrapsychic. So one of my books, for example, and I'm republishing it now, called Healing the Heart of Conflict, and it's on eight aspects or facets of conflict analysis and resolution that happen right inside your relationships. And the most critical and first category that is the most radical, because ours is a field, and my work for 30 years has been a work of practice, not just analysis, is self-examination. That's a very odd place to begin in academia, with self-examination as your first form of analysis. In the 19th century, it was very common. Serious thinkers and writers and researchers would write 3-4 autobiographies in order to really understand their own biases. I mean, we talk today in a postmodern sense about bias, but they really worked at their biographies and said, who am I? And what does that have to do with why I'm looking at this the way I'm looking at it? And we take that very seriously in conflict analysis and resolution, because we all have certain positions. We all have tendencies, some of which are rational and some of which are very irrational, and we bring them to bear as we look at a conflict, as we look at how we want to reconcile with people. So these kind of methodologies are things that we put into practice, and as we started to work on this on an international scale in many conflicts, we were astonished by who was very good at this and who was very bad at it. In other words, what are the skills that actually make people start not killing each other? What are the skills that create relationships across enemy lines that become natural to some people and impossible to others? And we started to notice patterns of that. One of those patterns is self-examination, people who are comfortable with looking at themselves. Another one was a comfort with analyzing emotions, one's emotions. Other steps that I talk about in that book focus on the capacity to really see all of human dynamics as they're going on. The capacity to hear everything that's being said. The capacity to imagine a future that's different than the present. One of the most important elements of conflict that persists is a fixation on the present and the past, an inability to imagine. Whereas people who are very good at relationships across enemy lines have a natural ability to dream and to think together and imagine new possibilities. Sometimes as simple as, for example, when I was in Ireland in '88, it was in '88, it was on the cutting edge of Belfast moving into a new relationship, and there were thousands of people working across enemy lines, Protestant, Catholic, and yet millions who were not. And what were the characteristics of people who were in that space and those who were not? And I remember being, after the conference that we had, this peace conference, we went for drinks afterwards because you can't do anything in Belfast other than drink. Everybody has to drink, right? And I can't take alcohol at all, but I had to go and participate. And I remember that there was like 7 women and a couple of men, and one of the women looked like she was going to faint. And I couldn't understand. She looked like she was afraid for her life. And all we had done was go down the street to the pub. And so I asked her, I said, what's going on? You know, I just looked at her, I said, what's going on? She said, and her voice started shaking, and she said, I've never been here before. So I said, what do you mean you've never been? I said, no Irish person's never been in a pub. So I didn't understand that. I said, she's definitely in a pub. I said, I've never been in this pub. I said, well, why not this pub? I said, this is the other side of town. I said, we just walked 10 minutes. She'd never been in her life on that side of the barrier. And so for her, it was a life-changing moment by walking 10 minutes. You know? So this is the identity, the spatial identity, the geographic identity. Who am I? I'm a person who never walks that 10 minutes. Whereas there are other people in the group that they had relationships all the time across lines. So that capacity to be comfortable with cross-sectionality, to be comfortable with the stranger, to be comfortable with imagining that, hey, yeah, let's try having a drink over there. That capacity, all of these things had a powerful impact on who becomes the peacemakers. And then there are other things that have to do with the capacity to act in a certain way that's almost symbolic action. Look, I have a chapter called Do. And that is the ability to act in a symbolic way that's transformative of relationships. And I'm going to get into examples very shortly. Then finally, dialogue, what everybody calls dialogue and overuses as a dialogue, which is very different. Peacemaking use of words is very different than normal dialogue, discourse, and negotiation. Peacemaking words are transformative at a cognitive and emotional level. It's the ability to say to somebody something that they've never heard before in their lives that shocks them. And we know that in cognitive psychology, shock is a transformation of the brain. Neuropsychologists, neurology and neurobiology are becoming very important for my understanding of the field and my future writing, because neurobiology helps you understand things about the brain that makes sense in terms of what we're seeing in conflict resolution, but didn't make sense in terms of the normal negotiations theory. It turns out the brain is in love with surprise. All parts of the brain light up when there's surprise. Now that's good news and bad news, and that's the whole point of neurobiology. All of these are neutral powers of the brain. It turns out that fascists and demagogues are very good at surprising your brain every minute. And that's why young people have to become very, very adept at seeing which kind of speakers manipulate with surprise and shock. It doesn't matter whether they're saying something disgusting. It matters whether they're bringing you into their orbit by constantly surprising you with something else that's outrageous. It's bullying, but it's also a neurobiological fixation of your brain. It's mesmerizing. It's hypnotic. It changes people. It almost makes them obedient to a demagogue. By contrast, people who surprise you with amazing gestures and feelings that you didn't think that enemy could possibly have about you, that also changes your brain. It surprises and delights you, like going to a circus. I never thought in my life I'd hear somebody from the other side say such and such and such. I have a deep friend, Father Ivo Markovic. Father Ivo Markovic is a Catholic priest from Croatia. And Father Ivo was a hero in the midst of that catastrophe in the war. And I'll never forget, with Father Ivo on a Friday night, we're in the high Alps in a place called Co in Switzerland, and we're overlooking the Lake Geneva, and we're with a lot of people who are there to celebrate the Sabbath with me. And because they wanted to honor me, and Father Ivo was one of them. And we're having this nice Sabbath interfaith meal. And I'm telling you, there's a whole world of people who cross enemy lines and relate to each other. Hi, right. Anne-Marie is one of them. And we're sitting there, and Father Ivo is, I here with my background, and Father Ivo is sitting there, and he's not very happy, and he's tortured because he's so traumatized by what he went through in the war and what he saw and what he had to do. And this was a man who literally got people one by one out of a concentration camp. He literally had to go by that concentration camp every day hearing the screams and then making friends with the guards in order to try to get a break, to get this family out and that family out. And Father Ivo, in the middle of this Friday night Sabbath meal, starts outlining to me the outlines of the concentration camp. So here I am, a Jewish rabbi, consoling a Catholic priest about a concentration camp that he had to deal with. You see, this world, it's very different. So oddly enough, I was consoling him, but it was also healing for me. Because again, in terms of the surprises of the brain, if you asked me in 1960, when I was a kid, just learning about the Holocaust, if in my lifetime I would ever be sitting there consoling somebody from the Catholic world about a concentration camp that he had to try to liberate, I would never have imagined that that would be part of my future identity. And yet, because it became part of my identity in this strange world of peacemakers and healers, and because it was a religious experience. It was a religious experience of transformation of horror into healing and solidarity. That kind of moment, I can tell you, in 30 years, it happens all the time between secular and spiritual people, enemies in many across the world, from Asia to Africa to the Middle East. This is a world of practice that should be analyzed more in terms of how to transform international relations to be less and less violent and more peaceful. We have a big problem, and those of you who are here probably have certain specialties that you're studying. How many people here are international relations? Okay. How many people political science? How many people anthropology? Psychology? Okay, interesting. What are the rest of you? Tell me what you're majoring in.
Football coach.
Football coach.
Conflict. We're making conflict.
Yeah.
I'm not really.
Yes.
Economics.
Economics.
History.
History.
Linguistics.
Linguistics. A lot of these are very important. Yes.
Theology.
Theology. Right. Welcome. Yes. So what we're discovering is that we have a problem in the non-hard sciences. And non-hard sciences have known this from the very beginning. It was so, we're all envious of the physicists and the hard scientists because the causality and the search for an understanding of causality based on empirical research is so much easier if you can limit the variables as much as possible and then test for changing those variables. The problem we have in the social sciences, and the problem even worse at the height of war, say in Syria right now, say in Israel-Palestine, say in Belfast, 1980, is that there are so many thousands of variables you can't possibly start to think in reliable scientific terms. It gets very difficult. I don't think that we should end that process of searching for the science of this. Because what I argue in my books is that we're looking in the wrong place. We were looking at hard sciences and engineering, and we should have been looking in medicine and epidemiology. Because medicine is used to a very complicated patient that has any number of surprising complications that are unique to that person. Epidemiology is looking for trends. It looks for things in a different way, with a different kind of investigation. And what I found in our work is that sickness and health is a far better metaphor, an analogy for what we're seeing in the field. What is a fundamentally healthy mind when it comes to conflict? What is a fundamentally sick mind when it comes to conflict? What is cancerous and what is healing? What words are inherently destructive? What thoughts are inherently violent? And what thoughts are inherently healing? And looking at it that way, we're making more progress. We're starting to realize, for example, and this takes a lot of understanding, we're starting to realize that every word that people say becomes a power of destructiveness or constructiveness. And this is the work that Marty Seligman and others have done in psychology to move us away from an excessive analysis of what is sick towards what is healthy and resilient. And there's a whole range of theory on resilience theory now. There's a whole field on optimism and on constructive or positive psychology. And we're starting to apply this to the field, and the kind of heroic people that I write about are these people who have this capacity, even in the worst situations, like Father Evo, to look at that situation and bring healing to both the soldier in the concentration camp and the victims trying to get out. How in God's name does anybody do that? Well, he found a way. And so he should be studied as a primal object of redemptive behavior. What in his Croatian religious construct gives him that capacity at that moment in history to both engage the soldier and engage the victim and help both of them out of hell? That's remarkable. That's like a discovery, like we would discover a cure for cancer in Brazil, in the Amazon. So we need to rethink the way in which we study the problem and also look for the solutions. The solutions are embedded in extraordinary people. Now, once you start to find these these diamonds, is that it's remarkable how many of them are religious, considering, or spiritual, or sometimes crazy mystical, considering how much of a problem religion has been to the history of violence. Organized religion has billions of deaths on its hands, on its responsibility. Organized religion is an organized power structure. It's even worse when religions aren't all that organized, because anybody who can be a demagogue can start to motivate a series of people to do horrific things that they never would do normally, but once they're convinced that it's in the name of God or they'll get to heaven, they'll do things they would never do otherwise. And this has been one of the most tragic aspects of history. What we're doing now is not that different than the kind of struggles that we had going back thousands of years. Many of you may know biblical literature. In biblical literature, we think of all of biblical literature as just religious, the priests in the ancient Jewish biblical literature, in the prophetic books, the priests are the problem. The priests and the kings are in league with absolute corruption and oppression of the poor and theft and endless warfare. And the prophets are standing up against them. So we have a struggle, not so much of religion versus secular, as much as prophetic versus the use of religion for violence, going back thousands of years. So this is not a new trend. Now, are the pictures up?
Yeah.
So,
Let me just, we lost it.
I can start getting up some of these things.
Bring up the- I want that, okay, go back there.
There you go.
Did I get rid of it again?
No, it's there. So let me just describe to you some of the work in the past 13 years, long before the Syrian catastrophe, where hundreds of thousands of people have died. And the Syrian dictator, Assad, has chosen to engage in the most amazing amount of killing of his own people that anybody could have ever imagined. It's one of the greatest catastrophes that the Middle East has ever seen. It's the greatest movement of people that perhaps in history, of this many people moving across the planet. And as you know, it has unsettled and destabilized places as far away as Europe, as Middle, Central, and Western Europe. So this is an extraordinary moment in human history. It's all coming out of this one space. Now, this man, his name is, he's the Grand Mufti of Syria. This is me, of course. This was the Grand Mufti of Damascus. That's the Assad guy behind us. This was a systematic effort for a number of years to engage in interfaith work at the highest levels inside Syria based on an alliance here. They knew I was a rabbi. My closest peace partner was a very prominent Syrian Christian. And this Mufti was famous in Syria for being a progressive for women's rights, for minority rights, okay? And he was despised by jihadis, by Wahhabis, by people who were inspired by an extremist philosophy coming out of the Gulf, out of the Sunni Gulf. And they tried to kill him a couple of times. Okay, that's 2006. And in 2006, the world was completely different. Syria was a haven for people who were, Syria was a haven for refugees, sometimes from Lebanon, mostly from Iraq. I spoke in front of 1 million refugees. I spoke in front of a hall of 5,000 Iraqi refugees, which the Grand Mufti didn't bother to tell me before I started speaking. I thought they were Syrians, but we didn't talk very much, and the secret police, the Mukhabarat, were always right in the room, so he couldn't talk to me very much. And he just said, you're going to say a few words. After I said a few words in the mosque, after the prayers were over, he later was attacked as being a heretic because he brought a non-Muslim to speak in the mosque and become part of the prayers, which was a lie. But that was the way they were trying to tar and feather him. The people in the mosque were upset that I was there. And they started arguing with the Grand Mufti right in front of me. And they said, "Why did you bring him? You know, he voted for Bush." I mean, these are people who'd lost everything. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed. Millions lost their homes. And he gives me the mic, and I'm shaking like a leaf. And I said, "We didn't vote for torture." You know, he introduced me to Abu Ghraib victims right on the spot. So this is a very different world. We were trying to heal in a very different way, where Syria was solid and the rest of the world was insane. And we were trying in our own limited environment, in a police state, to create relationships between Sunni, Shia, Christian, Jewish, Alawite. This man was always with me. He's Alawite. I taught conflict resolution together with my Syrian partners. We had people in the class from every class of society, and they were studying and taking each other's perspectives. Perspective taking and role playing is a deceptively simple form of conflict resolution that basically requires you to step out of your own body and have empathy with another person's perspective. Many people are changed permanently just by doing that. And we had people doing this in class. They became champions, and they started doing this all over Syria. Now, this was 2006. This is the Syrian peace partner in Kabawa. This was the class that I would take. I would take my American classes to teach in conflict resolution. This, by the way, was somebody who was sequestered and not allowed to speak for years in southern Syria. His name is Jawdat, and Jawdat is a pacifist Islamic theologian, highly trained, an amazing person. He's well known all over the Middle East, and of course, it was difficult for Syrians to accept his philosophy after the killing began and the torture began from the government of the children, and it all became this crazy jihad that everybody got into and started funding from across the Middle East. Now, that was that world. Now we're in a very different world. We are in a world where this is more what we're trying to do. Here. So, this man, he used to be a Grand Mufti of Damascus, an assistant Grand Mufti of Damascus. He's one of the leading scholars. And Yaqoubi, his name is Sheikh Yaqoubi. And Sheikh Yaqoubi wrote a book. He joined the opposition because he couldn't stand what Assad was doing to the people. He joined the opposition. He is a Sufi. Sufism is a kind of very spiritual philosophy of Islam that is utterly opposed and hounded by Wahhabism. Sufis across the world embrace music and song and a very different kind of spiritual Islam as opposed to an extremely restrictive one. Sheikh Yaqoubi wrote a book from a Wahhabist perspective, from a fundamentalist perspective, for lack of a better word, arguing why ISIS is evil. And he made it a very simple book that could be distributed to soldiers across Syria. Not soldiers, jihadis across Syria. And him and I, and this is Kevin Averick, this is Ambassador David Saperstein, who was in an office on religious freedom in the State Department, but also a rabbi, and we worked on how we could encourage that interpretation of Islam and spread it. Now this is as you can see, this is right in the bowels of a very, very difficult universe. And you have to ask yourselves, just like Father Evo asked himself, what do you do in the midst of hell? How do you move things in a better direction? Father Evo found his way to people's hearts in Croatia. He made a choir. In the middle of the war, he made a choir of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the middle of the Bosnian War. And it's not that different from Sheikh Yaqoubi going all the way from being a Mufti in Damascus with the regime to becoming a person writing a book, pleading with people even as if he was a Wahhabi, to stop joining ISIS, to stop targeting people who were not Muslim or who were not their kind of Muslim. So, and by the way, and this is why it's hell, this man, the Grand Mufti of Syria that we were so allied with, Assad had him encourage more killing in Syria. He had him join the war against all of the people resisting. See, it's a very, very bloody situation that looks like it's about religion. And when you get into the bowels of this war, it's not about religion. You see a deep struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran on Syria's soil. You see a deep struggle between Russia and the United States on Syrian soil. The foot soldiers and the people being used are being motivated and manipulated through religion. But as you get into it, and as you discover the people that are acting in it, you discover a very secular universe of raw power. You discover that it's even worse than that Saudi and Qatar at one point, both Wahhabist countries, funding different armies across Syria and not allowing those armies to actually cooperate because they were like running different horses and they wanted their horses to win. This is how bad it got. I actually met with the opposition many times. We actually had programs, maybe I can come it up here, and women in conflict resolution are so critical across the world, and one of the key things that are changing, I don't know if I have a picture of it here. Oh, I know where it is. I'll find it in a minute. This is the work we do now with children. These are the children and the refugees and the survivors that we're working with in terms of trauma and recovery. All I can say is that in Turkey, what we did was we actually got together. We actually managed to put together the opposition that everyone in the world had tried to keep apart, to simply work on civil society together. They were not even allowed by their proxies, by the people paying for their wars, to talk about civil society, to talk about recovery, to talk about Syria. This is the hell that goes on in the middle of the war. And you have to ask yourself, and our fields have to ask yourself, what can be done? And that's where I argue that there is a lot to be done. Because what we see from Ireland, if you look at Northern Ireland right now, you're looking at Syria 40. You're looking at what Syria today is what Ireland was like 40, 50 years ago. Impossible chaos. People with guns running everywhere. And then slowly over time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, thousands of Irish people, Catholic and Protestant, weave together new relationships based on the skills that I mentioned before. And there was at least 20,000 in a very small island, to be sure. And a much easier situation to heal than the Middle East. But with those 20,000 people working their heads off to build relationships across line, to imagine a new world, then came in the powerful figures who finally said enough is enough. And this is after 500 years of Protestant Catholic war in Europe. This was the last place, Belfast, Northern Ireland, was the last place of the Protestant Catholic wars that had killed so many hundreds of thousands over the centuries. And people said enough is enough. Senator George Mitchell, Tip O'Neill, Boston College, everybody should know Tip O'Neill, Patrick Moynihan, the Clintons, the Kennedys, and they came and they helped the people on the ground with millions of dollars to do the transformational healing. And when the United States made that legislation and made that fund, it changed. Now, in many ways, that's what we will need someday in the Middle East. There are so many people invested in keeping this conflict going right now. Iran and Saudi, especially. Radicals beyond the Saudi family. Qatar, Russia. There's so many people keeping this going. It's very hard to imagine where will be the consensus to help the few people to change things that I work with. But I can tell you that they are there. They have the same kind of genius as very religious Muslims that Father Ivo had in Croatia. And that this is what we need to shift to in terms of international strategies. No matter how bad the war, we must find the diamonds in the rough, and work on empowering them and learning from them what can heal that situation. This is the direction that we feel is necessary. I could give you many more examples, but I see, is that clock accurate? Does it say 10 to 6? So I want to have some time now for Q&A, okay?
Yes, we'll have some time, and then will there be I think there will be a reception outside the door. But as you say, 10 to 15 minutes, if there are questions from the audience.
So I want a place to be able to write them. Okay, I'll take up one. Okay, I want to hear some questions. Go ahead. Yes. What's your name?
Molly.
Molly.
Being that there is the Syrian refugee crisis and a generation of children that aren't being educated in a typical fashion, how do you think it's the best way to educate those children to be peacemakers? And were you able to see any of that happening as well?
Okay, good. Now I'm the kind of, I like to hear many voices, so I will hear many and then I'll respond. So who else would like to say something? I know I threw a lot at you. Yes?
Hi, my name's Austin. I study Arabic in Austin. I study Arabic and political science here. So I was interested in how you talked about how shock and surprise that there's goodwill efforts can really have in a person. So I wanted to ask you, how does personal experience from having like someone across from you, like what I thought was the Christmas peace in World War I, when the French and the British and the Germans were playing soccer and singing Christmas carols. But then when their commanders found out about it, they're emotionally mortified and had the men rotated out. So I was wondering if having that personal interaction is really what's quite important, and does that naturally call for more personal relationships among like diplomats and people of power in efforts for peace?
Excellent. Okay, we'll get to that. Yes, Professor.
I want to try to draw a bridge between your introduction and your conclusion and see if you can help me understand something I can't seem to wrap my head around. You began by saying essentially that the problem is religion since biblical times, that essentially you said that organized religion is like organized crime, kind of, that the culprit is religion, but then the conclusion seemed to say that the problem in Syria is not religion, it's something else. So within the context of the Middle East, where essentially everything is religion, how do you help me understand this? I mean, even in colloquial sort of languages, there's an expression, a term of endearment in Aramaic, in Arabic. You call somebody dini when you're calling someone my beloved, my religion, essentially my law, not only my law. So it's really
right.
Very almost guttural kind of feeling. So how?
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes.
Yes, Marc, I would like to talk about another conflict where you've worked a lot, Israel and Palestine, and there were many thousands of people, of healers and peacemakers, as you described them. and it did not really make any difference for many, many years. What did they do wrong? I mean, what was really, I mean, or could they do anything different?
Correct. Okay. These are all great issues. It's a lot of hands. That's one. Yes. What's your name?
Michael.
Michael.
I was wondering if you thought that these peacemakers, if you thought that their nationality made any difference, whether or not it would be more beneficial to the problem at hand, whether these people were Arabs, if they came out of places in the Middle East, Lebanon, Egypt, or any of the countries surrounding the issue at hand, or if you thought that really anywhere could provide the sort of people that have that issue.
Right. Yes.
So it seems to me that intuitively,
What's your name?
I'm Sissy. Intuitively, being a peacemaker as an individual, or like facilitating an interpersonal relationship just with another person, seems to be fairly universally intuitive. But with the crisis and political chaos that's going on, we really need like peacemaking on a much higher level. So how do we facilitate or like start from the individual level and like how does the bridge from individual level and to like the political level
Good.
really connect?
Good. Okay. One more. She had her hand first. Go ahead.
Christine. I was just wondering if you saw a near end to the conflict in Syria, and if so, what role do you think faith will play in its reconstruction?
Okay. That's very good. Okay, all great. And we can have more. Okay, so let me just try to address these. Actually, when it comes to children and resilience, that's actually, there's so much good literature on that, and we personally witnessed, I don't have the time to show you the pictures right now, but the healing work and the resilience of children, even who suffered trauma, is amazing. Okay, when I first started going to Jordan and Turkey, everybody, the adults were so depressed, and the children were in such a bad state. And every year that I go back, the children are doing better and better, and the Syrian professionals are getting better and better at what they're doing. Some amazing work in psychology of healing of even the most damaged kids, the ones who've seen beheadings, the ones who've been bombed, the ones who lose limbs actually are not in as bad shape sometimes as the ones who witnessed horror. And there are really cutting edge methodologies of healing those kids. And basically it's comfort level, it's comfort, love, care, and especially order and calm and a predictable universe. I mean, I'm just being very, very summing up here, but actually a lot of advanced psychology work is going on that I think is very promising. We ourselves, my students, set up a school to help those kids matriculate into regular Jordanian schools, and we meet with them regularly. Psychosocial healing work is very effective, even for people who come for just a week or two. And I think there's a lot of promise for children if there's enough attention paid to them. Again, and this ties in with other questions that were asked here, somebody you asked, we don't have a global power structure that understands this. They understand the humanity of doing poverty relief work, the humanity of AIDS prevention, of Zika prevention, of health interventions. But they don't understand that psychosocial illness and psychosocial healing are critical to the stability of a society, to the recovery of society. So we have like 90% of the kids in Gaza are trauma victims. And nobody seems to think that that has something to do with why every generation there's another group that gets embedded there like ISIS. You know, there's no connections because really our world of power structures is primitive. It's very primitive still. I find far more receptiveness to this in Pentagon than I do in Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill is going actually backward, and the Pentagon is actually going forward. The police in the United States are going backward, and yet a lot of international work of security agencies is going forward. A lot of intelligence agencies get this, but a lot of people giving out the money for Congress, they're doing the opposite. They're re-traumatizing. They're labeling people. There's so much that's going on that's destructive because the power structures are in a very problematic state. So that's the work to be done. is to start demonstrating with psychosocial healing that children are at the core. Every teenager is going to be a terrorist or a soldier, a fighter or a soldier. He's going to have a gun in his hand in many places in the world. Is that gun going to be used wisely and carefully and judiciously, or is it going to be used to destroy? And that's something that's in the hands of the people who are supposed to be taking care of the kids. It's a literal front and center issue of security. It has to be a change in how we see the planet, the health of the planet, the stability, even the economic stability of the planet has to be looked at in terms of what's happening with the children and teenagers, especially the male teenagers, but really all of them. The shock and surprise and the personal relationships are at the core. And that experience in Christmas was one of many. And at that moment in history and that moment in time, the power structures of continuing the killing were too powerful for just a few soldiers that managed to make a breakthrough on the front. And that's a lesson we have to learn about many, many things. That's what I was saying before, and we'll get to this, but basically, power structures are the overriding things that make things go on this planet. Secular power structures, secular interests of large empires, of large and powerful interests. Then occasionally there are things that break through to disrupt that. And what's interesting and what we need to study more is when do those disruptions lead to a paradigm shift? Now, what happened in World War I was very messy because an awful lot of Europeans did have it with war. They were done. But the way in which the reigning powers solved the World War I problems was by giving rise to the possibility that an entire nation would feel victimized and brutalized and then be subject to a demagogue, namely Hitler. So there wasn't a lot of thought about how to end the war in terms of a conciliatory, visionary way. Opposite of General Marshall at the end of World War II, where he said, if we punish every single person, if we kill every single person who killed, Europe is just going to go through this endlessly. And he said, we can't afford that because we have the Soviets, we have a problem, we need to establish a new society based on democracy and human rights. And that's exactly what eventually happened. So the power structures are unavoidable in terms of them buying into the new paradigms. But those soldiers played their role as visionaries and courageous people who set the tone for something that everyone else thought was impossible. And that's all we can hope for from people who are doing this in Israel-Palestine. We don't know when those visionaries are going to be vindicated someday. But the amount of energy, Israel-Palestine embodies a 2,000-year-old struggle between the power structures of the Christian world, the power structures of the Jewish world, and the power structures of the Islamic world. So those power structures are still very much in place. There is more than enough money and more than enough people who want to fight to the last Israeli and Palestinian to keep it going for a very long time, with all of the grievances in place and all of the religious justifications in place. So that's where some of my colleagues focus on timing and when the timing is right. And clearly, the timing for an authentic change in Arab-Jewish relations, in Arab-Arab relations, in Sunni-Shia relations, in Sunni-Shia-Christian relations is not here. On the contrary, where there may be, I have my own notions of, and this is something that people might disagree with me, but you gotta, often when you can't understand the big things, you gotta look at small cases. Liberia is a classic small case of autogenocide. And there was something in Liberia that people don't realize, and that is that the world wanted the diamonds more than anything else. And every kid could become a millionaire just by taking a bunch of diamonds, and he could get a machine gun and a Mercedes. When every kid can get a machine gun and a Mercedes for a few diamonds, you have the complete destruction of the culture. So even though we could look at the horrible warlords that were teaching these kids a kind of devil worship and a kind of inversion of African religion, and getting them to kill their own parents and all of that, we can get into it. And there's a whole literature on it. As long as the world wanted those diamonds, no matter what, then it was guaranteed that that culture would be destroyed. I agree the same thing about oil. Oil is the lifeblood of the world. A diamond is a luxury. But oil will all starve to death and sweat to death and lose all of our jobs unless the oil keeps flowing. So until that fundamentally changes, all the money and power is in the hands of people who have no motivation whatsoever to invest in people and to stop wars for war's sake, to gain territory, to gain influence, to gain power. And that's the tragedy of what was done to the Middle East because of this dirty little thing called oil. And I do believe it was done from without, originally by other empires, but now it's really self-motivating within the system. And these are very large events, and this is where I wanted to respectfully say to you that it's what we see on the ground is a very complex picture where religion is both such a frame for the wars, but at the same time, when you look beneath the surface, it's astonishing how many people want to live together and they're not allowed to by money that keeps pouring into the situation. I was in Syria from 2003 on. I have to tell you that as much as I despise Assad and his family, and I knew that there was a Nazi criminality about it from the beginning. There was actually an alliance with some former Nazis. And you know, when he meets with the Pope, and he says to the Pope, I mean, it was so outrageous in the modern world, especially with the nice popes we've had, to sit there and huddle with him and say, you know, we both have the same enemy, the Christ killers. You know, it was like out of World War II. He didn't have a clue about how outmoded. Okay, so I could sit there from my culture and say, the Alawites are insane. But I get to the ground, and my best students are Alawites. My best, but they're very secular, because as a minority, and I know this very well as a Jew, they see secularity as their haven from tyranny, because they suffered so much in history from Islamic tyranny. What they see is Islamic tyranny. So there's so much in the Middle East that's basically crying out for a United States of the Middle East. A United States based on a Bill of Rights and Constitution for minorities and majorities, et cetera, et cetera. But people are not allowed by the power structures and struggles to get to that space. But we, in our little way in Syria, we proved that we could do differently. I literally, late in the game, everybody at the table has lost family. They lost everything. I have a Sunni, a Shia, an Alawite, very secular atheist, a very religious Mufti, Sheikh Yaqubi, and we're all sitting at the table. You know what we're doing at George Mason University? We're sitting there, 20 people, figuring out a constitution for Syria. And what happened within a half a day, based on some guidance, is that everybody's shouting, because of course you're shouting in the Middle East, but we started listing what everybody wanted. Because I started to focus less on the grievances and more on what do you want? And everybody started listing those wanteds. It came up to 19 things that everybody wanted. Basically all these rights. And I looked at them, and then they were shouting, and they would not be able to agree on the Constitution because of religion. Is it going to be an Islamic country? Or that's where. So I looked at them and I said, let's look at all of these. These 19 things that you've all agreed upon, is that real Islam? He said, yes, that's real Islam. I said to the secular person, is this real democracy? He said, yes, that's real democracy. I said, then don't call it anything. Don't call it secular. Don't call it religious. Just agree to those 19 things, and heaven is there. And it was like a light bulb. You know, now I'm being facile. It was one moment in history, but you'd be shocked that they went all over Washington
with lots and lots of money, and nobody got them to that space. But we got them to that space because of our hearts, because of our empathy with each and every one of us. And we are the only ones who put Alawite, Sunni, Shia, a Mufti together in the same room. Nobody else did that. Women, many women, secular women, all together with this Mufti in the same room. So we as activists know that this is possible. We know the same way that a doctor will look at a cancer cure and say, this is possible. But the patient's still dying because of many, many factors that are keeping them sick. So we're curing the cancer, but pneumonia gets them, and overwhelming systems get them. Or we have a cure for cancer, but the guy's in a hospital that's being bombed right now. He can't possibly survive. So you see, this is where we have to get nuanced about potential assets of spirituality, of religion, of culture, and at the same time understand the enormous powers that are using that culture to continue their paths. And I'm not demonizing, by the way, the Saudis, because there's a lot of wonderful people in Saudi trying to do the same thing. People who live in Jeddah and other places. It's not about one country that's bad. It's that all over the world, people are struggling between power structures that want to pursue certain interests for money and other people who are trying to live across barriers and boundaries, but get caught up. They get caught up in fear, and all they can rely on is their fellow Jews, their fellow Christians, their fellow Orthodox, their fellow Sunni. You know, if I was living in the hell of Iraq right now, would I as a Sunni just run to a Shiite community and say, here, protect me? No, because it's so bad. So we have to appreciate that and empathize with it, and at the same time start building these communities across enemy lines, and we do. So I think, even though I didn't exactly answer all of the questions, I think that it's in the spirit of that to, I want to make sure that I didn't.
You can't continue out the hall where there's
Yeah.
reception.
End to the conflict is the only thing I didn't say from Christine. And that I'll just say, we don't know. I work inside State Department a lot. I'm very, very frustrated that we haven't figured out the right way to stand up to Russia and at the same time be invitational and respectful. It's a strange thing. For so many years of this war, it was very clear the Russians had a base in Tartus. They couldn't give that up. It was the only base they had in the Middle East. And America was happy to join the jihadis and let this whole place fall apart. So we need honest, tough conversation between the powers that be. And all of them put their interests on the table. Isn't it shocking to you that there's never been a call for a peace conference between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Isn't that amazing? With all the destructiveness? Because apparently it's in nobody's interest to do that yet. So we have to keep working and slightly pressing and embarrassing powers that be about why do you really want this conflict to end? What are your interests? Put them really on the table and then keep pressing. So we both do the grassroots work, but we have to get much more savvy with governments and power structures and ask them the right questions to push them in a less violent direction. Okay, thank you.